17 from verse 13 and 19 says it like this. Jesus is engaged in a prayer. And he says it like this. He says, I am coming to you now. And he's talking to his Father. He says, I'm coming to you now, but I say these things while I am still in the world, so that they may have the full measure of my joy within sight of them. He tells his Father, I'm coming to you now, but I'm going to announce these things. I'm going to pray for these things. I'm going to start proclaiming and talking about these things so that they, say with me, they. Say with me, me. Say, look at somebody and say, you. I want you to know that Jesus verbalized this in his prayer. Though he was going to God, he wanted to make sure, I'm going to make sure I make this announcement in prayer so that you and I will have the full measure of his joy within inside of us. Verse 14 says this. He says, I have given them your word, and the world hates them. I've given them your instruction, and the world does not like it. I've given them your purpose. I've given them your ideas. I've given them heaven's perspective, and yet the world wants to go the different route. The world doesn't agree with it. The world dislikes it, but I've given them your word. And the Bible says, and the world hates them, not because the world is hateful, but because they're not of the world any more than I am of the world. Look at somebody and say, God called you to be different. I heard a quote one time, and I'll finish reading the verse, but I thought it was pretty cool. I was reading a book. And you guys know who Dave Ramsey is? This has nothing to do with the sermon, but it just came to me when I said that God called you to be different. He's a financial, guru, if you want to look at it that way. And he has this certain phrase about finances. He says it like this. He says, normal people, right? Normal people are broke. So be different. You guys got that? Stop trying to be normal. He says normal people are broke. So you, don't be normal. Be different. Look at somebody and say, be different. Be different. Verse 14 says, I've given them your word, and the world hates them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. And he says, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. And it says, sanctify them by your truth. Right? Sanctify them by your truth. And he confirms it and says, your word is truth. To sanctify means to cleanse them. Right? He says, sanctify them by your truth, because your word, which I've given them, is your truth. And then he says this, as you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. Have you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. Look at somebody and say, you've been sent. You've been sent. So act like it. You didn't just appear. Christ says, look, you sent me into the world, and just like you sent me into the world, so I have sent them. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified. For them I sanctify myself, so that they truly may be sanctified. I want you to know this morning that Christ is fully aware that you and I belong to him. He's fully aware of it. As a matter of fact, he announced it in his very prayer to his Father. He's fully aware, but Christ is also fully aware that you and I don't belong to the world. You and I are not called to live like the world, but we are called to live like Christ. So I want you to say some statements with me until it's truth in your heart. Say with me, I don't belong to the world.
I don't belong to the world.
So I may stop living for the world.
So I may stop living for the world.
We'll say it one more time. Some of you said it backwards. Say, I don't belong to the world.
I don't belong to the world.
So I must stop living for the world.
I must stop living for the world.
Now say this, I don't belong to the world.
I don't belong to the world.
So I must stop living like the world.
So I must stop living like the world.
You and I don't belong to the world, so we got to stop living for the world, and we need to stop living like the world, because the Bible says when Jesus began to pray that they're just not ordinary people. I gave them your word, and the world hates them because they don't belong to your world, yet they are there because I sent them just like you sent me. And I think it's important that we understand why we are to keep our minds and our hearts centered on God. It's so important that you and I understand that we are to keep our minds, say with me, minds. Say, I got to get my mind and my heart aligned with God. The reason why I say this, and I may say some things that I talked about on Friday, but I'm going to reiterate it again. The reason why I say this is because every one of us, without wanting to, without deciding to, without thinking about it, every one of us is being impacted and affected by this world's culture. Every one of us is, right? The more we are impacted by this world's culture, the more we stray away from the truth. 4 statements that I want you to understand. Every one of us is being impacted by today's culture because we live in it. We breathe culture. We wake up and we understand culture. That's all that we know. We've been raised in culture, but the problem is that the more that we are impacted, the more that we stray away from the truth. The more that we are impacted, the more we try and manipulate the truth. We don't just stray away from the truth. Oftentimes we try to manipulate the truth. The more we are impacted, the more we try not to just stray away from the truth, or we try to manipulate the truth, but we also try to bend the truth. And we don't just try to manipulate the truth and bend the truth and run away from the truth, but the more we are impacted by our culture, the more we are confused about the truth. And it's important that you understand this, because tell your neighbor, say, you are not from the world.
You are not from the world.
Now look at them and say, so stop being so dominated by it.
Stop being so dominated by it.
See how the voice is lessened? Look at somebody and say, you are not from the world.
You are not from the world.
So stop being dominated by it.
Stop being dominated.
It's important that we understand this principle, because our weapons, how we do things, how we operate, how we survive, it isn't like everybody else. The way that we live and how we function, how we view ourselves, how we view life and the situations, it's not the way that we view everybody else. And I want you to know this. This is a truth that I want you to understand. How many of you know that our view of God should change? Right? Because we can't see all of God in this one instance. In this one setting, I can't see all of God. But although our view of God should change, it should not be influenced by our experience within our culture. Our view of God should change, but it should not be influenced. Say with me, influence. It should not be influenced by our experiences within our culture. It should be influenced by heaven's arrival in spite of our culture. Can I say that one more time? Though our view of God should change, it should not be influenced by our experiences within our culture. It should, however, be influenced by heaven's arrival in spite of our culture. For example, and we talked about this Friday, when Jesus goes up to his disciples and he says, who do they say that I am? He was causing a separation between those that belong to him and those that don't. And he says, who do they say that I am? And Peter gives this brilliant answer. He says, or the disciples go, some of them say this, and Peter, he gives his response was correct because it was tied to heaven. He says, you are the Son of the living God. I want you to know that you will not know who Christ truly is, and you will not understand what he desires for us if we are not plugged into heaven. When Peter gives this brilliant response and he says, you are the Son of the living God, Christ gave him a revelation. He gave it not just to him, but to all his disciples. He says, that which you say is correct, but it was not revealed to you because you are being intertwined with your own culture. It was revealed to you because heaven came in spite of your culture. He was telling Peter that that information that you grabbed, we couldn't study it, we couldn't read it, someone didn't write it, they didn't tell you, it wasn't whispered to you. It wasn't because philosophers and theologians came together and they decided we can understand God, we know God, and this is the way that it is. That is who you are. As a matter of fact, a lot of us, we don't really know who we are as people, as children of God. We don't know who the world is in context of God, and we judge them the wrong way. But if you get heaven's information in your soul, you'll be just like Peter. God says that information that you had, that you just uttered within your mouth, he says, that comes from heaven. That knowledge comes from heaven. But it's important that you know that you will not know who Christ truly is, and you won't understand what he desires for you. When you don't understand what he desires for you, you start to manipulate and concoct your own desires. You start to desire things that are not aligned with him. You start to go in directions that are not aligned with his direction. And you're wondering why you're not seeing him the way that you would want to see him. But God says, look, you got to allow heaven to invade your territory. I want you to know this morning that we cannot be plugged into heaven if we are not keeping our eyes on Christ who comes from heaven. These are truths that we ought to know, but God wants you to understand who you are. He wants you to know how you are to function. He wants you to know how you are to walk. And the reality is this: you cannot be plugged into heaven if your eyes are not set on the one who comes from heaven. Look at somebody and say, I want you to teach, I want you to preach with me. Look at your neighbor and say, you need more of heaven. Look at somebody with intention. Say, you need more of heaven than you do of earth. If you are to understand heaven so that it can impact your earth. You need more of heaven than you do need of earth if you are to understand heaven so that it can impact your earth. It's important that we understand this, church. If we don't understand heaven's perspective, then we won't understand our purpose here on earth. Because our purpose here on earth is directly tied to heaven. If we don't understand heaven's perspective, if all you do in your life is build visions and build missions and build things and build desires and allow things to kind of go into your mind, and you're impacted by the world's culture and you never tap into heaven, you're misinformed. Because if you don't understand heaven's perspective, you'll miss it. If you don't understand heaven's perspective, then you won't understand your purpose here on earth, because our purpose here on earth is directly tied to heaven. Jesus says it in his prayer. He says it like this: as you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. Look at somebody and say, you've been sent. What Jesus is saying is that, in other words, my coming to the world was not a coincidence, nor was it a matter of luck. I was destined to come, I was purposed to come, and I was prepared to come. But the same is true for you and I. We were not just born into this world, we were sent into this world. We don't just exist, we have a reason for still breathing. We aren't just anyone, we belong to him who called us from darkness into his wonderful light. But it's important that you realize that you are not to do things like everybody else does them. Say it out loud with me. Say, I'm not just living. I'm on an assignment. I'm not just living, I'm on an assignment. But you got to make sure that you are on the right assignment. Here's my title for this morning as I come to the second half of what I'm going to talk to you guys about. My title this morning is Run Your Race. Look at somebody and say, run your race.
Run your race.
Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 from 24 to 27 as as we talk about this before we end exactly what God wants you to know this morning. It says it like this. It says, don't you realize that in a race everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So make sure that you're running to win. Verse 25 says, all athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we, say with me, but we do it for an eternal prize. I want to read that again because it's important. All athletes are disciplined in their training, and they do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So Paul says here, so I run with purpose in every step. And he says, I'm not just shadow boxing, I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself be disqualified. The Apostle Paul uses athletic terminology to convey spiritual truths in his epistles. He uses athletic terminology. He uses what they understood. He's talking about the Isthmian Games. These were games that were near Corinth. They happened about once every 2 years. And I love the fact that he uses this. Because in his times, there were multiple events that were happening. Things like boxing and running. There were multiple events that people understood. And if there's one thing that Paul understood, is that the people of that time, the people of Greece, they understood what it meant to truly train and be focused. And I love that he talked about that because as a young boy, I was also into the track and field, and I'm not boasting, but I was pretty good. Now, you may not ever read about me, and that's okay, but I'll tell you. I was pretty good as a young boy. At the age of 9 years old, I ran in my first Junior Olympic. And I didn't just run in my first Junior Olympic as a 9-year-old boy. I made it 3 years in a row, qualifying above thousands of kids that were competing in these events. And I was fortunate enough to travel while running. I was also in the newspaper, but you may not find that as well. But as a young boy, I knew all about track and field, and I love that Paul referenced this event, this moment, because if there's anyone that could teach you about running, it's me. And Lewis, he ran too. But sorry, Lewis, I was in the Junior Olympics. It may not seem like a big thing now, but it was major before. I got to go to places like Canada, and I've run in Nevada in the mountains, and I've run in Florida and Louisiana, and I've gone to Dallas, and I've gone to a lot of places that I was fortunate enough to compete in these competitions. But you know what was the most important lesson that I learned in these competitions? The most important thing, and I remember as a kid, even when I go to a track now, I can smell it. If I walk into a track and field, I could smell the ground. I could smell the track. It was a thing for me. Like when I walked in, I just knew something was going to happen. It kind of got in my bones. I was nervous. There were butterflies. But the most important thing was not my training. Though I trained very hard, I would run and run and run and run. And as a kid, I didn't really notice, and I didn't know that I had stamina until they made me run, and I ran and I finished. And the coach was like, run another 4 laps. And I ran another 4 laps and I was done. And then he says, run another 4 laps. And he started monitoring me until he started making me run 12 laps. And I'd run 12 laps and I was done and I was still breathing. But I was fast and I didn't know it. I thought it was normal, but it wasn't. And he trained me and trained me and trained me and trained me. But every time I went to an event, the most important thing was not my training. The most important thing at an event was not that I was breathing and controlling my breathing. My coach would run to me and he said, breathe in and breathe out. And no matter where I ran, he was on the outskirts of the gate and he'd run with me and start screaming at me if I ever looked back. That wasn't the most important part. It wasn't the training. Because when you train your body and you start to run, it automatically kicks in. Right? You don't think about like, oh yeah, I remember I was doing sit-ups and I remember that I ran in the morning so that I can get my breathing right. It kind of just happens. The most important lesson that I'd ever learned at any levels of competition, and this may sound stupid, it was making sure that I registered for the right race. Whenever I go to these massive competitions, there were so many people around. There were all these tables. And it was important that I registered for the right race, because based on my registration, they gave me a number that I had to put on my chest. And when they called that number, I had better be on that line. Because once they shot the gun, the race had already started. But the most important lesson I'd ever learned was that I had to make sure that I registered for the right race. Because do you know how embarrassing it would have been if I lined up with all my guys that were running with me, thinking that I was in my race, and they shot that gun, and I was known for running long distance, though I was a pretty good sprinter, but I was better at holding my stamina. Could you imagine? Speaking about imagining, I remember one time I was still young, we were running indoor. And whenever you run long distance, when you're running long distance, you are to pace yourself. But we were running this specific race with this one kid that just kept beating me. I just got so mad. His name, as a matter of fact, I'm not going to say because it's going to bring back bad memories. But it was this one kid. He just always would beat me. And he would annoy me because anytime I ran with him, he'll be right in front of me, and his father would always say like a phrase. And whenever he said that phrase, this kid booked. He was gone, and I no longer could keep up with him. The entire race, I'm running with him, and I'm running. And in my mind, I'm thinking, when we get to this last turn, and I'm taking this guy, and here goes his dad. It's like if he reserved his speed until his dad said the right word. And the moment he uttered it, this kid took off, and the distance between us would widen and widen. And this one particular race, I got so upset. But if you're a long distance runner, you're called to pace yourself. And I remember getting on the track, and I'm looking at this kid, and in my mind I'm thinking, I'm going to beat this kid today. A long story short, I did. But I remember they shot that gun, and I took off on a sprint. I ran so fast to get away from the pack, and I don't think I've ever seen my coach that mad. He's running, he's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Slow down. Because you're going to get tired. What are you doing? He was so upset I took off in a sprint. And the only reason why I won that race is because I didn't want to see his rage, and I didn't want them to catch me. And I kept running, and I'm sprinting, and I lost my mind that race. But he was yelling at me because that is not the way you start a race when you're running long distance. So taking that into effect and understanding that, could you imagine that I registered for the wrong race, and I'm on the line, and we're talking about a stadium filled with people. I'm not talking about like, yeah, it was 30 people that showed up at your race. There probably were thousands of people. And I'm standing on the line, and I'm getting ready to go, and they blow that gun, and because I'm on the wrong race, everyone takes off in a sprint, and I'm pacing myself. And without realizing it, the race has already finished, and I'm still running, but I didn't win because I registered for the wrong race. Had I known it was a sprint, I would have begun to sprint. But because I was registered for the wrong race, and I thought it was long distance, I put myself to think I'm going to pace myself until I get away from the pack. But as they blew that gun, everyone takes off, and I'm still just behind, just pacing myself, wondering what in God's green earth are they doing, and all of a sudden the race is over. I say this to say that it's important that you and I know which race we're running. Too many times in life, and when I reference you, I'm talking about me. You is us. Too many times in life, we are running a race that we were never intended to run. Too many times our hearts and our minds are registered for the wrong race. And we're trying to keep pace with people. And we're trying to keep pace with the economy. And we're trying to keep pace with trends. And we're trying to keep pace with things. and we're trying to keep pace with stuff. And what Paul is saying here is that you better make sure that you are running the race that you were intended to run. My son's laughing at me because I lost a bunch of them. Can I reread that verse for you before I go and I finish? It says here, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs? Can I rephrase that for you? Don't you realize that although everybody runs, everyone's not running the same race? Don't you realize that just because everyone is moving, everyone's not moving in the same direction? Don't you realize that just because you are living, you are not called to live everyone else's life? He says, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one gets the prize? And he says, so run to win. And he says, all athletes, they're disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it. Say with me, we do it. The race that we run, it's an eternal prize. So he says, run with purpose every step of the way. I want you to know this morning that though we are in a race, we are not all running for the same prize. You got to be aware of this every time that you wake up in the morning, that life is like a race. Everybody is moving in some sort of direction. But Paul is trying to remind you, and God is trying to remind you, and he's using me to remind you and to remind me that though we are all in a race, we are not running for the same prize. We are not running to get the same thing. Our end results are not the same like everyone's end results. But if you start running for somebody else's prize, you're going to be running the wrong race. Because what God calls you to live and what he calls you for is so much higher than anything else. Although we are both running, we are not necessarily running the same race. Though we may be living in this world, we are not living for the same reason. It's important that you understand that there is a distinction. There's a difference between who you are in Christ and who you are outside of Christ. Once you understand that, you'll have less complaining because you'll realize that the one that is inside of you is controlling everything on the outside of you. When you realize that the race that you run is different from everybody else's race, and what you're competing for and your prize and what's at the end, when you realize that it is different, you'll stop comparing yourself with the person next to you. You'll stop running the same race, trying to compete in the same levels of competition. Though we are both on a mission, we are not chasing the same vision. I want you to know that there has to be a separation. Can you say that word with me? Say, I gotta be separate. Until you capture that truth, you'll always be the same. But I want to rephrase a quote that I read before, or that I said before. Say with me, normal people don't serve Christ. So be different. Normal people don't run to Christ. So be different. Stop trying to be normal. Stop trying to be like everyone else. Normal people don't have the will of God secured in their hearts, so be different. There has to be a separation between your race. What you are living for and training for, and what the world is living for and training for, has to be different. Because how many of you know that we are all training for something? Every time that you and I wake up in the morning, we are training our bodies, our hearts, and our minds for something. But what the world trains for and what you and I ought to train for, there has to be a gap or a difference. The race that they run is for a prize that will fade away, but our race, say with me, our race is for an eternal prize. The race that we run is directly tied to heaven. I'm almost done, but I got to get this through your minds and in my mind, because God ain't finished speaking, and He wants to get your desires and your minds aligned with Him, because too often we are going a whole different direction. Too often we are taking our own desires, our emotions, our will, our intent, and we are going about our life declaring to the world that this is what God put in my heart. Too often we are wasting time and energy running for things. Like let me ask you a question. I want you to internalize the answer. Whatever you are doing when you wake up, and every time you go to work, and everything that you are pursuing, ask yourself the question, what am I going to get at the end? Ask yourself the question, when it is all said and done, and I've wrapped it all up, and I've made it to the mountaintop, what then? If the answer to that question isn't tied to an eternal purpose, there's a possibility your heart isn't aligned in places that it should be aligned with. I'm going to prove it to you through His Word that He wants you to align your heart and your mind. Your mind deals with thoughts and reasons and your thinking. Your heart deals with desires, the conviction, and the emotion. Your mind and your heart, they work together. When you think about things a lot and it gets ingrained in your heart, you start to desire those things. That's why you got to watch where your eyes are watching, because when you watch it, you start to want it. What you allow in your eyes kind of filters in your heart, and you start to think about it and it goes in your heart, and you start to desire it, because your heart, it deals with your emotion, your desire. If I'm running a different race for a different prize, and although I train my body like an athlete, my training has to be different. Say with me, there has to be a distinction. Most people, when training, will depend on their skill and hard work. Is it okay if I speak for you this morning? Most people, when they're training and they're going about life, they depend on their skills, what they've acquired, on their training, on all of their hard work. But I must depend not on my flesh, but on the work of my Savior. I'm here to tell you that the way you train your mind and your body has to be completely different if you are running the right race. Most people will depend on their life skills. They will depend on their experiences. They will depend on their strength, on their brutal strength, on their mind, on their intellect. But I must not depend on my flesh. My dependence has to be in the one who saved me and called me to His name. The type of training that I must be engaged in is tied to the one that I am believing in. My training is all about the heart and the mind. I must set my mind on things that are above and not things that are below. If how you train yourself as a man, if how you train yourself as a woman, how you train yourself as a young adult, as a teenager, if it is tied to your culture, if it is tied to the things that you've learned along the way, I am here to tell you, you've been training for the wrong race. How you discipline your body, how you discipline your heart, how you discipline your mind, how you train yourself to make sure that what you are living for is eternal. It is different from your neighbor. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3, and I promise you I'm almost done. Give me 5 minutes. It's going to be the quickest sermon I've ever preached. Because I thought it was simple. Colossians chapter 3 from 1 to 4 says this. It says, since then you have been raised with Christ. It says, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Let's read that one more time. Since then you have been raised with Christ, God says, set your desires, set your convictions, set your emotions. God says, set your hope on things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. And then he tells you, now set your mind, say with me, mind. He says, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. He first instructs you to set your heart, which are your desires. God says, take your desires and place them on heaven, because you are directly tied to it. Take your heart and place it on heaven at the right hand side of the Father or the Son, where he seats next to the Father. And then he says, now take your mind and set your mind on things above. For you died, and your life now is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. If I set my mind on Jesus, he will bring my life into alignment. The race that I'm running is worth the wait, and it is also worth the prize. God tells you this morning, when you wake up and you go about your day, he says, make sure that you are running the right race. Make sure that everything that you pursue and everything that consumes your mind, from the time that you wake up to the time that you go to sleep, because he wants you to know everything that consumes your mind will inevitably affect your perspective. And as it affects your perspective, your view of God will change. Rather than draw closer to God, you may draw away from God. Because you'll start to look at everything that's happening around you, and you'll start to question, God, where have you been? And God looks at you and says, you were built different and designed different. I have told you in the past that you are to take your heart, which is the center of your desires, and you are to place it in heaven. And you are to take your mind and you are to place it with heaven. When you place those things in heaven, and I aligned your purpose along with my purpose, you'll learn to rejoice even when things are happening, because I am in control. Look at somebody and say, this is simple. This is simple. Right? This is simple. God wants you this morning to run your race. The church has been running a lot of events. We're competing in a lot of events. But God says you've been competing in the wrong one. The race that I've called you for has an eternal prize. It goes beyond you and your life. If your race is about your personal prize, it's about what you will get, you are running the wrong race. If your life is consumed and what you want with all of your heart and mind, right? How many of you know that we be wanting things with our hearts? Like, if I could have what I want. Because I desperately want it with all my heart. And the reason why we say that is because we've been thinking about it for a very long time. And when you've thought about it for a very long time, and you've thought about all the pluses it will have for you, and all the great things it can produce for you, and all the wonderful things it could serve to you, and all the great things that it could do for you, and you start to think about it, you start to desire it. And when you desire the very thing that you've been thinking about, you start to pursue it. If we are to pursue God with who we are, it starts with you setting your mind and your heart in the right place. Because if you start thinking about God's graciousness and you start thinking about His goodness and you start to think about who He is and what He's done for you, you start to desire that thing which you've been thinking about. And when you start to desire that thing which you've been thinking about, you start to pursue those things. I want to read the last verse. It's found in Hebrews chapter 12 from verse 1 to 3. We're going to finish it here. Hebrews chapter 12 from verse 1 to 3 says it like this. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down. We love to go to that next part. But God says this morning, what's slowing you down? What slows you down from trusting in me more? What slows you down from truly believing that I have a plan for your life? What's been slowing you down? Because whatever's been slowing you down, the word says we are to strip it off. Whatever's been distracting you, whatever's been in the way, whatever's been causing you and your thoughts to be foggy, whatever's been changing your view of God, God says you are to strip that away. But it doesn't just finish there. It says, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially, say with me, especially, the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. God tells you this morning, you and I are supposed to run a race. But the race that you and I are to run has to be the race that He has placed before you. The race that you and I are to run, because if you didn't know this, you and I are running some races. And the race that you and I have been called to run has only been the race that God says, I've put in front of you. Then He answers the question of how do we run the race that God has placed before us? It says here in the next verse, we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting Him, He endured the cross, disregarding His shame. Now He is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. If we go back to the verse that John talked about in chapter 17, he says, I'm going to the Father, but while I'm here, I got to declare some things over their life so that my joy can be complete in them. Let's go back to reading that before we close. He talks about this prayer and he says, I'm coming to you now. Because the only reason that Jesus was able to endure His cross was because of the joy that was set before Him, and that joy was God. He was able to disregard and keep pushing through regardless of the obstacles that were in His way, because His mind and His heart was set on heavenly places. Here in the book of John, in this very moment, He's coming to the end of His race. And He's talking to His Father, and He says, I know that I'm coming to you. I know that I'm at the end of my race. And He says, but I say these things while I'm still in the world, so that they may be full, or they may have the full measure of my joy within inside of them. I've given them your word. I've instructed the church, I've instructed them to keep their eyes set on me. God wants you to know this morning that He has given us His word. And His word says that you are supposed to run the race that's been set right before this. You know how you run that race? You run that race by keeping your eyes and your heart set on Jesus.
Amen.
That's how you train your life. I know that we got a lot of important things in our lives, like our children and our careers and the things that we want to do and the trades that we want to compete in and all the things that we want to do as individuals, as people, and none of those things are wrong. But God says when you train yourself, your training consists of things that are different. You can't keep your eyes glued on your phone for hours of the day looking at things that you want. This is not how we train ourselves. But this very device that everybody has in this room is slowing us down. So God says you got to throw it away. Strip off the weight that has been slowing you down. This world that we live in, it's all about information overload. Too much information can create your mind to be heavy. Too much heaviness in your mind, it will slow you down, it will weigh you down. You wouldn't be able to keep your mind on God because there's too many thoughts. We got too much access to too many things. It's just too much. God says there's too much happening in your mind and there's too much happening in your heart. Every other day you are changing your desires. Every other day you are changing what you want to do. Every other day you are changing your sense of direction. Every other day you are thinking about different things. There's too much that's consuming you. If you fill up your mind with other things and you fill up your heart with other things, God says to you this morning, where do I fit in? Where do I fit in? You know, the Bible talks about taking his yoke. You know what a yoke is, right? We've talked about this before. It's what they would put on animals to kind of keep them together. And usually the animals would be carrying a weight. But Christ says, take my yoke, for my burden is lighter than yours. Because when you wear my yoke, you're not going to be walking down with your head bent. You're not going to be so distracted with life all day, waking up in the morning. You're not going to be distracted with things, looking down. God says, my yoke is different. Because I give you the strength to look up. And the benefit of being yoked along with God is that when he looks up, you have to look up. Because the pieces are tied together. When he starts to look up, you have no choice but to look up. God says, you got to keep your eyes on me. Keep your thoughts on me. Keep your hearts in me. Fill yourself up with who I am. So that you can understand that you may not have the things that you've been wanting, because how many of you know we want things? You may not have the very thing that you've been wanting, the very thing that you thought, if I just had it. If I just had that one thing. God says, you know why you don't have that one thing? Because that's not your prize. If you had that one thing, God says you're going to want another thing. And when you get another thing, God says you're going to want another thing. And after you get that thing, you're going to want another thing, because the last thing couldn't quench you. The last thing didn't fill you. The last thing, though it was exciting, once you had it, it was boring again. God's like, the very thing that I want to give you is eternal. It's bigger than you. It's greater than you. But you got to be plugged into me. If you're not plugged into me, you'll never know my intentions for you. If you're not plugged into me, how do you know the course of action that I'm taking? If you're not plugged into me, you'll mistake the stresses of life for the lessons of life.
Wow.
You start to think, God, I'm stressed out. God says, nah, you're in lesson mode. If you're not plugged into me, God says, you won't understand me. You won't understand where I'm coming. They sent Christ to the cross because they weren't plugged into him. Where are you sending your Christ? Are you sending him away as well? The Bible gives us a story of, at one point, they put Barabbas and Jesus right there. They said, which one do you want? And people yelled out Barabbas. Let me ask you a question this morning. If God this morning were to put himself as an option, and put the things that you want as another option, which one will you scream for? We read things in Scripture that we don't understand because we're not plugged in, not because it doesn't make sense. We try to figure out Scripture. Rejoice in the times of trials and tribulations. It doesn't make sense, and we try to rejoice by convincing the world that we're telling them, I'm happy although I'm struggling. Because we're running the wrong race, God says. Keeping your eyes on me sounds simple, but it's so hard in the world that you and I live in. Our culture teaches us to never stop moving. Never stop. As a matter of fact, a lot of times we don't make time for one another because we're too busy. But we're usually not busy keeping our eyes on God. We're busy training for other things. As a church, God tells us this morning, if you want to understand my direction and where I'm headed, take all of your thoughts, everything that you've been reasoning, everything that's been consuming you, God says, and place it on me. And then take your hearts, your desires, your emotions. God says, put it on me. And I'll enlist you in the right race. And you'll see that at the end we did it. You'll see that at the end you became a part of my plan. I want you to stand with me this morning. And I want to remind you, there is no other way around this. There's no other way around it. I don't care how you're trying to think it in your mind. Your mind and your heart influences your patterns of life. You are not walking the way that you're walking because you have less. Your financial situation, your marital situation, your personal situation, it is not the way it is because it's a mess. It's the way it is because of your mind and your heart. You've been thinking about it the wrong way. You've allowed it to affect you the wrong way. God says there is no other way around it. Stop letting life consume you. Be consumed by me, God says. Be consumed by me.